Welcome to another exploration into the darker corners of American history, stories that remain as mysterious as they are unsettling. Before we begin, take a moment to let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time of day or night this narration has reached you. It's always intriguing to see how far these accounts travel and when they find their audience. With that said, let's journey back into the past. The humid air of New Orleans carried more than just the scent of magnolia blossoms and café au lait on that fateful day in April 1835. It carried screams that had echoed through the night for years, muffled by the thick walls of one of the French Quarter's most elegant mansions. What neighbors would discover behind those walls would shake the very foundations of New Orleans society and birth a legend of horror that continues to haunt the city nearly 2 centuries later. Picture, if you will, the grandest mansion on Royal Street. 3 stories of pristine white columns and wrought iron balconies, where crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows through tall windows. This was the home of Madame Delphine Lalaurie, a woman whose beauty and charm had captivated New Orleans' elite. But on this particular April morning, as thick black smoke poured from the mansion's windows and desperate cries for help pierced the air, the carefully constructed facade of respectability was about to crumble forever. The fire started in the kitchen, they said. A simple accident, perhaps a careless moment with the stove. But as firefighters rushed into the burning building, axes in hand and determination in their hearts, they were unprepared for the horrors that awaited them. The screams weren't coming from the main floors, where the Lalaurie family lived in luxury. They were coming from below, from the servants' quarters, from places where no human voice should ever cry out in such agony. When the first rescuer broke through the door to the slave quarters, the sight that greeted him would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. Chained to the walls were human beings in various states of torture and mutilation. Some had been there so long they could barely lift their heads. Others bore fresh wounds that spoke of recent unspeakable cruelty. The air was thick with the stench of human suffering, and in that moment, the elegant world of New Orleans high society was forever stained with blood. But how did it come to this? How did a woman who graced the finest ballrooms of the French Quarter, who was welcomed into the most prestigious homes, become the architect of such unimaginable horror? To understand the monster that was Delphine Lalaurie, we must first understand the woman she appeared to be. Born Marie Delphine McCarty in 1787, she entered the world as a member of New Orleans' most prominent Creole families. Her father, Louis Barthélemy de McCarty, was a wealthy plantation owner with connections that reached deep into the heart of Louisiana's power structure. Her mother, Marie-Jeanne L'Érable, came from a family that had helped establish the very foundations of New Orleans society. From birth, Delphine was destined for greatness, or so it seemed. The New Orleans of Delphine's youth was a city unlike any other in America. French and Spanish influences mingled with African traditions and American ambitions, creating a unique culture that prized elegance, refinement, and above all, appearances. The wealthy Creole families lived in magnificent mansions throughout the French Quarter, their lives a constant display of sophistication and social grace. Opera houses, grand balls, and elaborate dinner parties defined their existence, while beneath this glittering surface, the brutal reality of slavery provided the foundation for their wealth. Delphine's first marriage, to Don Ramon de López y Angulo, a Spanish officer, ended tragically when he died under mysterious circumstances. Some whispered that he had discovered something terrible about his young wife, but such gossip was quickly silenced by the powerful McCarty family. Her second marriage, to Jean Blanc, a prominent banker and slave trader, elevated her status even higher in New Orleans society. Blanc's wealth allowed Delphine to live in unprecedented luxury, but his sudden death in 1816 left her a widow once again, this time with considerable inheritance and even more questions surrounding her husband's demise. It was her third marriage that would seal her fate and provide the stage for the horrors to come. Dr. Leonard Louis Nicholas Lalaurie was a respected physician, a man whose standing in the community was beyond reproach. When he married the beautiful widow Delphine McCarty Blanc in 1825, New Orleans society celebrated the union as a perfect match. The newlyweds purchased the magnificent mansion at 1140 Royal Street, a three-story testament to their wealth and status that would become synonymous with unthinkable evil. The mansion itself was a marvel of architectural elegance. Its pristine white facade gleamed in the Louisiana sun, while intricate wrought iron balconies adorned each level like delicate lace. Inside, crystal chandeliers illuminated rooms filled with the finest European furniture, imported silk wallpaper, and art that spoke of cultured tastes and unlimited resources. The Lalauries entertained lavishly, hosting elaborate dinner parties where the most influential citizens of New Orleans gathered to discuss politics, business, and society gossip over the finest French wines and exquisite Creole cuisine. Madame Lalaurie was the perfect hostess. Her beauty was legendary, her wit sharp, and her charm irresistible. She spoke fluent French, Spanish, and English with equal eloquence, and her knowledge of literature, music, and art impressed even the most educated members of society. Guests at her soirees included judges, politicians, wealthy merchants, and plantation owners whose decisions shaped the destiny of Louisiana. Among her frequent visitors were men like Pierre Soulet, who would later become a U.S. Senator, and prominent businessmen whose names graced the streets and buildings of the growing city. But even as Delphine Lalaurie dazzled New Orleans society with her grace and sophistication, careful observers began to notice troubling signs. The mansion's staff of enslaved people seemed unusually fearful, their eyes downcast, their movements nervous and hurried. Unlike other wealthy households, where slaves might develop close relationships with their owners, the Lalaurie servants appeared to live in constant terror. The first whispers began among the other Creole families, passed in hushed tones during intermissions at the opera, or in the quiet corners of elegant drawing rooms. Marie Laveau, the legendary voodoo priestess whose influence extended throughout all levels of New Orleans society, was among the first to speak openly of her concerns. She had heard things, she said, disturbing things about what happened behind the closed doors of the Lalaurie mansion. The French Quarter of the 1830s was a place where secrets were hard to keep. Servants from neighboring houses gossiped at the French market while selecting vegetables and seafood for their employers' tables. Washerwomen shared stories as they scrubbed clothes along the banks of the Mississippi River. And in the shadow of St. Louis Cathedral, where both masters and slaves attended services, observant eyes noticed the haunted expressions of those who lived under Delphine Lalaurie's roof. Dr. Lalaurie himself began to show signs of strain. Colleagues at the medical college noticed his increasing nervousness, his tendency to drink heavily at social gatherings, and his reluctance to discuss his home life. Some wondered if the respected physician was aware of his wife's activities, while others suspected he might be an unwilling participant in whatever was transpiring at 1140 Royal Street. The neighborhood children, with their keen instincts for danger, refused to play near the Lalaurie mansion. Local folklore began to grow around the house, with stories of strange lights flickering in the windows at night and unexplained sounds that seemed to emanate from deep within the building. Even the most rational citizens of New Orleans found themselves crossing to the other side of Royal Street when passing the mansion, though few could articulate exactly why they felt such unease. The French Quarter's architecture, with its thick walls and interior courtyards, was designed to provide privacy and protection from the elements. But in the case of the LaLaurie mansion, these features served a darker purpose. The sounds of suffering were muffled by heavy masonry, and the courtyard's high walls blocked the view of anyone who might have intervened. What should have been a sanctuary became a prison, and the very design that spoke of old-world elegance concealed new-world horrors. As 1834 turned to 1835, the whispers grew louder. A neighbor claimed to have seen a young slave girl fall from the mansion's roof while attempting to escape, her broken body discovered in the courtyard below. Others reported seeing enslaved people being led into the house in good health, only to disappear entirely or emerge weeks later bearing visible signs of abuse. The local authorities, however, seemed reluctant to investigate a woman of such high social standing, especially when her husband was a respected member of the medical community. The turning point came on that humid April morning when acrid smoke began pouring from the LaLaurie mansion's windows. Whether the fire was an accident or a desperate cry for help from someone trapped within may never be known, but its consequences would expose secrets that New Orleans society was unprepared to confront. The fire began in the mansion's kitchen, where an elderly slave woman was reportedly chained to the stove as punishment for some minor transgression. As flames spread through the building, neighbors rushed to help, forming bucket brigades and calling for the city's firefighters. But when they demanded access to all parts of the building to ensure everyone's safety, Madame LaLaurie became strangely evasive, insisting that certain areas of the house were too dangerous to enter. It was Judge Jacques-François Canonge who first refused to accept her explanations. A man of unimpeachable reputation and considerable authority, he demanded that every room be searched for potential victims. When Delphine LaLaurie continued to resist, claiming she had lost the keys to the slave quarters, the judge ordered the doors broken down. What they found behind those doors would haunt New Orleans for generations. The first rescuer to enter the servants' quarters was a volunteer firefighter named François Thibodeau, whose account was later published in the New Orleans Bee newspaper. His testimony, preserved in the city's archives, provides one of the most reliable descriptions of the horrors discovered that day. According to Thibodeau, the air was thick with the stench of human waste and decay, and the darkness was broken only by narrow shafts of light filtering through barred windows. As their eyes adjusted to the gloom, the rescuers began to make out human forms chained to the walls. 7 slaves were found in various states of torture and mutilation. Some bore evidence of recent beatings, their bodies covered in welts and cuts that appeared to have been inflicted systematically over time. Others showed signs of more elaborate cruelty. It spoke of a mind obsessed with causing pain and suffering. The most disturbing discovery was a woman whose limbs had been broken and reset at unnatural angles, apparently as part of some twisted experiment in human anatomy. Another victim had been subjected to what appeared to be crude medical procedures, with surgical wounds that had been allowed to fester and become infected. The scene suggested not just cruelty, but a methodical approach to torture that indicated extensive planning and preparation. Several of the victims were still alive, though barely. Their weak cries for help revealed that they had been confined in these conditions for months, possibly years. Water and food had been provided in quantities just sufficient to keep them alive, but never enough to allow for healing or recovery. The systematic nature of their treatment suggested that their suffering was not the result of momentary rage or punishment, but rather an ongoing project of calculated cruelty. Among the survivors was a woman named Leah, whose testimony would later prove crucial in understanding the extent of Delphine LaLaurie's crimes. Despite her weakened condition, Leah was able to describe how Madame LaLaurie would visit the slave quarters regularly, sometimes alone and sometimes accompanied by her husband. These visits, according to Leah, were not inspections or punishments in any traditional sense, but rather sessions of deliberate torture carried out with what appeared to be scientific curiosity. The rescuers also found evidence of victims who had not survived their ordeal. Human remains in various states of decomposition suggested that the horrors had been continuing for years, with bodies buried in shallow graves within the mansion's courtyard or disposed of in ways that prevented discovery. The scope of the crimes began to expand beyond anything the investigators had initially imagined. As word of the discoveries spread through the French queue, crowds began to gather outside the LaLaurie mansion. The initial shock gave way to outrage as details of the torture chamber became known throughout the community. Citizens who had dined at the LaLaurie table, who had praised Delphine's charm and sophistication, now found themselves confronting the reality that they had been entertained by a monster. The New Orleans Bee, the city's most prominent newspaper, struggled to find words adequate to describe what had been uncovered. Their April 11, 1835 edition contained detailed accounts from multiple witnesses, but even the sensationalist journalism of the era seemed inadequate to convey the full scope of the horrors. Editor Jerome Bayon wrote that the discoveries at the LaLaurie mansion surpass in horror anything that we could have imagined possible in our civilized community. Dr. LaLaurie's role in the atrocities remained unclear, but his medical training made his presence during the torture sessions particularly disturbing. Several witnesses reported seeing surgical instruments among the tools used to inflict pain, and the precise nature of some injuries suggested knowledge of human anatomy that only a trained physician would possess. Whether he was an active participant or a coerced observer became a matter of intense speculation throughout New Orleans. As the full extent of the crimes became apparent, the crowd outside the mansion grew increasingly agitated. What had begun as shocked curiosity transformed into righteous anger, as citizens realized that such atrocities had been occurring in the heart of their community while they went about their daily lives. The elegant facade of the mansion, which had once symbolized the pinnacle of New Orleans society, now seemed to mock the very concept of civilization. The authorities found themselves in an unprecedented situation. Never before had crimes of such magnitude been committed by someone of such high social standing. The usual procedures for dealing with criminal behavior seemed inadequate when the perpetrator was a woman who had been welcomed into the finest homes and whose husband held a respected position in the medical community. The social implications of prosecuting Delphine LaLaurie extended far beyond the crimes themselves, threatening to expose the dark underbelly of New Orleans' slave-based economy and the willful blindness of its elite class. Judge Canonge, who had ordered the doors broken down, found himself at the center of a social and legal maelstrom. His decision to investigate the mansion thoroughly had been vindicated by the discoveries, but it had also unleashed forces that would reshape New Orleans society. The judge's own diary, preserved in the Louisiana State Museum, reveals his struggle to comprehend how such evil could have flourished under the noses of the city's most prominent citizens. As afternoon turned to evening on that April day, the crowd outside the LaLaurie mansion continued to grow. Word had spread throughout the French Quarter and beyond, drawing people from all walks of life who wanted to see for themselves the house where such unthinkable crimes had been committed. The mood was growing increasingly volatile as details of the torture chamber circulated through the crowd like wildfire. The immediate concern of the authorities was getting the surviving victims to safety and medical care. Dr. Robert Dow, one of New Orleans' most respected physicians, volunteered to treat the survivors despite the personal risk to his reputation from being associated with the case. His medical notes, later submitted as evidence, provide clinical descriptions of injuries that read like something from a medieval torture manual rather than a 19th-century American city. Meanwhile, Delphine Lalaurie had retreated to the upper floors of her mansion, apparently hoping that the crisis would pass and normal life could resume. She seemed genuinely surprised by the public reaction to the discoveries, as if she believed that her social position would protect her from consequences. This disconnect from reality would prove to be her undoing, as she had seriously underestimated the power of public outrage in a community that prided itself on its civility and refinement. The evening newspapers carried banner headlines about the Chamber of Horrors discovered on Royal Street, and by nightfall, the crowd outside the mansion had grown to nearly 1,000 people. The atmosphere was charged with an energy that city officials recognized as potentially dangerous. New Orleans had seen riots before, usually centered around political or economic issues, but this was different. This was moral outrage on a scale that threatened to overwhelm the normal channels of law and order. As darkness fell over the French Quarter, torches appeared in the crowd, casting flickering shadows on the white facade of the Lalaurie mansion. The elegant building that had once been a symbol of success and refinement now looked sinister in the dancing light, its windows like dead eyes staring down at the angry mob below. Someone in the crowd began to chant for justice, and the cry was quickly taken up by hundreds of voices. The New Orleans Police Department, still a relatively new institution in 1835, found itself facing a crisis for which it was unprepared. Captain Tremoulet, the senior officer on duty, recognized that the situation was rapidly spiraling beyond his control. The crowd was demanding that Delphine Lalaurie be brought out to face justice. But the mansion's heavy doors remained locked, and there was no response to the police demands for entry. Inside the mansion, the Lalaurie family was facing a decision that would determine their fate. Dr. Lalaurie's attempts to convince his wife to surrender herself to the authorities were met with stubborn refusal. Delphine maintained that she had done nothing wrong, that the treatment of slaves was entirely within her rights as their owner, and that the public reaction was simply an example of mob hysteria that would soon pass. This fundamental misunderstanding of the situation would prove to be typical of Delphine Lalaurie's psychology. Despite overwhelming evidence of her crimes and the obvious horror they had inspired in the community, she seemed incapable of grasping the moral dimension of her actions. To her, the torture of enslaved people was simply an extension of her property rights, no different from any other use of her possessions. As the night progressed, the crowd's patience began to wear thin. Calls for storming the mansion grew louder, and several attempts were made to break down the front door. The city's prominent citizens, many of whom had been guests in the Lalaurie home, found themselves in the uncomfortable position of trying to calm a mob while privately grappling with their own shock and disgust at what they had learned. Pierre Soulet, the future senator who had frequently dined at the Lalaurie table, took it upon himself to address the crowd from the mansion's front steps. His speech, later published in full by the New Orleans Bee, reflected the community's struggle to understand how such evil could have hidden behind such elegant facades. "We have been deceived," he told the crowd, "not just about the character of one woman, but about the very nature of the society we thought we knew." The reference to society was particularly pointed, as many in the crowd were beginning to question how extensive the knowledge of Delphine Lalaurie's crimes might have been among New Orleans' elite. Had others known what was happening and chosen to remain silent? Were there other houses in the French Quarter where similar horrors might be occurring? The implications extend far beyond the crimes of one individual to encompass the entire social structure of the city. Dr. Dow's preliminary medical report, delivered to the authorities late that evening, provided clinical confirmation of what witnesses had described. His professional language could not disguise the horror of what he had seen, and his recommendation that several of the victims required immediate surgery to have any chance of survival underscored the systematic nature of their abuse. The doctor's report would later become crucial evidence in understanding the full scope of Delphine Lalaurie's crimes. As midnight approached, the crowd showed no signs of dispersing. If anything, the numbers continued to grow as word spread to neighborhoods beyond the French Quarter. Workers from the docks, shopkeepers from Canal Street, and even some of the city's free people of color joined the vigil outside the mansion. The diversity of the crowd reflected the universal horror that the discoveries had inspired across all segments of New Orleans society. It was sometime after midnight when observant members of the crowd noticed movement in one of the mansion's upper windows. A carriage had been quietly brought around to the rear of the building, and preparations were apparently being made for the Lalaurie family's departure. The discovery that the family might be attempting to escape triggered a new wave of anger in the crowd, and several groups broke away to surround the mansion and prevent any possibility of flight. But they were too late. In the pre-dawn darkness of April 11, 1835, Delphine Lalaurie, her husband, and their children managed to slip away from the mansion through a rear exit that led to the stables. A carriage was waiting, and by the time the crowd realized what was happening, the family was already racing through the narrow streets of the French Quarter toward the Mississippi. Pie River waterfront. The escape had been carefully planned, suggesting that Dr. Lalaurie, if not his wife, understood the gravity of their situation and the impossibility of remaining in New Orleans. Local folklore suggests that they were aided by sympathizers among the city's elite, who were more concerned with protecting their own social standing than ensuring justice for the victims. Whether this is true or merely part of the legend that would grow around the case, the fact remains that the Lalaurie family successfully fled the city despite being surrounded by hundreds of angry citizens. By dawn, when the crowd discovered that their quarry had escaped, their anger found a new target: the mansion itself. What began as an attempt to search for additional victims quickly transformed into systematic destruction. Room by room, the elegant furnishings that had once impressed New Orleans society were dragged into Royal Street and destroyed. Crystal chandeliers were smashed, fine furniture was broken apart, and artwork was torn from the walls and trampled underfoot. The destruction of the mansion's contents took on an almost ritualistic quality, as if the crowd was attempting to purge the community of the evil that had lurked behind such beautiful facades. Silk wallpaper was ripped down, imported carpets were thrown into the street, and even the mansion's elaborate ironwork was damaged in the frenzy of destruction. By the time the authorities managed to restore order, the interior of what had once been one of New Orleans' most magnificent homes had been completely gutted. The symbolic nature of the destruction was not lost on contemporary observers. The New Orleans Picayune noted that the crowd seemed particularly focused on destroying items that represented wealth and refinement, as if trying to reject the very values that had allowed such horrors to be concealed. The beautiful objects that once served as symbols of success and sophistication were now seen as props in an elaborate deception that had hidden unspeakable cruelty. As news of the Lalaurie escape spread throughout the city, speculation began about where the family might have gone. The most logical destination was France, where Delphine's family connections and wealth could provide both sanctuary and anonymity. Ships departed New Orleans for European ports regularly, and a family with sufficient resources could easily book passage without attracting undue attention. Captain Jean Delery of the merchant vessel Sultana later claimed that a family matching the Lalaurie description had boarded his ship just hours after the fire, paying premium prices for immediate passage to Le Havre. Other witnesses reported seeing a carriage racing toward the docks in the early morning hours, but the chaos surrounding the mansion made it impossible to confirm these accounts definitively. The failure to capture Delphine Lalaurie became a source of lasting frustration for New Orleans authorities and citizens alike. Judge Canonge, who had ordered the initial investigation, spent years pursuing leads and following up on reported sightings. But the trail had gone cold almost immediately. The family's wealth and connections had provided them with resources that made escape not just possible, but almost inevitable. In the days following the discovery and escape, New Orleans found itself grappling with questions that went far beyond the crimes of one individual. How had such atrocities been allowed to continue for years in the heart of the city's most fashionable neighborhood? What did the case reveal about the broader treatment of enslaved people in Louisiana? And perhaps most troubling of all, how many other houses in the French Quarter might be concealing similar secrets? The investigations that followed revealed disturbing patterns throughout New Orleans' slave-owning community. While few cases approached the systematic cruelty discovered at the LaLaurie mansion, evidence emerged of widespread abuse that had been tacitly accepted or deliberately ignored by authorities. The case had forced the city to confront the brutal realities that underpinned its elegant lifestyle, and the reckoning was both painful and necessary. Marie Laveau, the voodoo priestess, who had been among the first to voice concerns about the LaLaurie household, found herself in the unusual position of being vindicated by mainstream society. Her warnings, which had previously been dismissed as superstition or gossip, were now seen as prescient observations from someone who understood the community's hidden dynamics better than its official leaders. The surviving victims of Delphine LaLaurie's cruelty became symbols of both the horrors that had been uncovered and the resilience of the human spirit. Leah, the woman whose testimony had provided crucial details about the torture chamber, was given her freedom and became a prominent voice in the growing movement to reform Louisiana's slave codes. Her speeches, delivered at churches and community gatherings throughout the city, kept the memory of the LaLaurie horrors alive and prevented the comfortable amnesia that might otherwise have allowed similar crimes to continue elsewhere. As weeks turned to months, reports began to filter back to New Orleans about Delphine LaLaurie's life in exile. Some claimed she had died in Paris shortly after arriving in France, overcome by guilt or disease. Others insisted she was living comfortably on her family's wealth, entertaining guests with the same charm that had once captivated New Orleans society. The uncertainty surrounding her fate only added to the legend that was already beginning to grow around her story. The mansion at 1140 Royal Street, its interior destroyed by the angry mob, stood pie for months as legal proceedings determined its fate. Eventually, it was sold to new owners who attempted to restore it to its former elegance, but the building's reputation made it difficult to find tenants willing to live there. The first family to move in reported strange sounds at night, unexplained cold spots in certain rooms, and an overall atmosphere of malevolence that made normal life impossible. These early reports of supernatural activity began the transformation of the LaLaurie mansion from a crime scene into a haunted house. Whether the phenomena were real manifestations of lingering evil or simply the product of suggestion and collective trauma, the stories spread throughout New Orleans and beyond. The mansion became a destination for the curious and the brave, though few visitors reported feeling comfortable within its walls. The case also had profound implications for New Orleans' medical community. Dr. LaLaurie's involvement, whether as an active participant or unwilling observer, cast suspicion on other physicians and raised questions about the ethical standards of the profession. Medical schools throughout the region were forced to address questions about the treatment of human subjects and the boundaries of legitimate research, establishing protocols that would influence medical practice for generations to come. The religious community, too, found itself challenged by the LaLaurie case. How could such evil have flourished in a city where church attendance was virtually universal among the upper classes? Had the comfortable relationship between religious institutions and the slave-owning elite blinded spiritual leaders to the moral implications of their silence? These questions sparked theological debates that continued long after the immediate crisis had passed. As 1835 drew to a close, New Orleans had been fundamentally changed by the discovery. At the LaLaurie Mansion. The city's elite society, once characterized by elegant certainty and refined confidence, now seemed more fragile and morally ambiguous. The case had revealed not just individual evil, but systemic failures that implicated the entire social structure of the antebellum South. The legend of Delphine LaLaurie began to take on a life of its own, spreading beyond the boundaries of Louisiana to become part of American folklore. Writers and journalists throughout the country seized upon the story as evidence of the moral corruption inherent in slave society, while defenders of the Southern way of life dismissed it as an isolated aberration that said nothing about the broader social system. But in New Orleans, where the physical presence of the mansion served as a constant reminder of what had occurred, the story refused to fade into comfortable historical distance. Each new tenant who attempted to occupy the building reported experiences that seemed to confirm the presence of something malevolent within its walls. The house became a symbol not just of past crimes, but of ongoing supernatural retribution, a place where the victims of cruelty might still be seeking justice from beyond the grave. As the years passed and direct witnesses to the events began to die, the line between historical fact and folklore became increasingly blurred. Each retelling of the story added new details, embellished existing accounts, or filled in gaps in the historical record with speculation and imagination. The result was a legend that was simultaneously more dramatic and less reliable than the already horrific reality it was based upon. Modern historians examining the LaLaurie case have struggled to separate verified facts from later additions to the story. While the core elements, the fire, the discovery of tortured slaves, the escape of the family, and the destruction of the mansion's contents, are well documented in contemporary newspapers and official records, many of the more sensational details appear to have been added over time by storytellers seeking to increase the dramatic impact of an already shocking tale. Dr. Carolyn Morrow Long, a scholar who has extensively researched the case, argues that while Delphine LaLaurie was undoubtedly guilty of serious crimes against enslaved people, the extent of her cruelty may have been exaggerated by sensationalist journalism and later folklore. The distinction is important, not because it minimizes the real suffering that occurred, but because it highlights the ways in which historical truth can be distorted by the very horror it seeks to document. The question of what happened to Delphine LaLaurie after her escape from New Orleans remains one of the most intriguing aspects of the case. Despite numerous reported sightings and alleged confirmations of her death, no definitive proof of her fate has ever been established. Some researchers believe she died in France within a few years of her escape, while others suggest she may have lived for decades under an assumed identity. The most persistent legend holds that she eventually returned to New Orleans in disguise, living quietly in a modest home far from the French Quarter while observing the consequences of her crimes. Supposed deathbed confessions and mysterious benefactors who aided former slaves have all been attributed to a repentant Delphine LaLaurie seeking to make amends for her past actions. These stories, while romantic in their implications of redemption and justice, lack historical verification and may represent more wishful thinking than reality. What cannot be disputed is the lasting impact of the LaLaurie case on American culture and consciousness. The story has inspired countless books, films, and television shows, each interpretation adding new layers to the legend while potentially moving further from historical accuracy. The mansion itself has become one of America's most famous haunted houses, attracting thousands of visitors each year who come to experience whatever supernatural phenomena might linger within its walls. The persistence of the LaLaurie legend speaks to something deeper than mere fascination with horror stories. The case represents a confrontation with the darkest aspects of American history, a reminder that the elegant facades of antebellum society often concealed brutal realities that were conveniently ignored by those who benefited from them. In an era when the United States is still grappling with the legacy of slavery and its ongoing effects on society, the story of Delphine LaLaurie serves as a stark reminder of the individual human cost of systemic oppression. The mansion at 1140 Royal Street continues to stand today, though much altered from its original appearance. Various businesses have occupied the building over the years, from apartments to restaurants to tourist attractions, but none have remained for long. The building's reputation seems to precede any attempt at normal commercial use, and many visitors report feeling an inexplicable sense of unease within its walls. Ghost tour guides in New Orleans inevitably include the LaLaurie Mansion on their routes, though the stories they tell often bear little resemblance to historical fact. The legend has become a form of entertainment, sanitized and dramatized for tourist consumption, which raises troubling questions about how society chooses to remember and commemorate historical trauma. The real victims of Delphine LaLaurie's cruelty deserve better than to have their suffering transformed into fodder for ghost stories. Yet the continued fascination with the case suggests that it serves important psychological and cultural functions. Perhaps the most valuable lesson to be drawn from the LaLaurie case is not about supernatural retribution or the persistence of evil, but about the dangers of willful blindness and social complicity. The horrors that occurred at 1140 Royal Street were possible not just because of one woman's cruelty, but because of a society that chose not to see what was happening in its midst. The elegant parties and refined conversations that characterized New Orleans' elite society served as a form of collective denial, allowing civilized people to avoid confronting the barbarism that their lifestyle depended upon. Today, as we grapple with our own forms of systemic injustice and institutional blindness, the story of Delphine LaLaurie remains disturbingly relevant. It reminds us that evil often wears a respectable face, that cruelty can flourish behind beautiful facades, and that the most dangerous monsters may be those who are welcomed into our finest homes and most exclusive social circles. The mansion on Royal Street stands as a monument to these truths, a reminder that the past is never truly past, and that the choices we make about what to see and what to ignore have consequences that extend far beyond our own lives. In the end, the true horror of the LaLaurie case may not be the supernatural phenomena that supposedly haunt the building, but the very human capacity for both cruelty and willful blindness that made such atrocities possible in the first place. The legacy of Delphine LaLaurie continues to evolve as each generation discovers her story anew and finds in it reflections of their own times and concerns. Whether viewed as historical fact, cautionary tale, or supernatural legend, the case remains a powerful reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath society's most polished surfaces, and of the moral vigilance required to prevent such horrors from occurring again. As the sun sets over the French Quarter and shadows lengthen across Royal Street, the mansion where these events unfolded stands as silent witness to one of America's most disturbing chapters. Its walls may no longer echo with the screams of the tortured, but they continue to whisper a warning about the price of moral blindness and the terrible consequences that await societies that choose comfort over conscience. In that whisper lies both a condemnation of the past and a challenge for the future. A reminder that the true measure of civilization is not found in its most elegant buildings or refined customs, but in how it treats its most vulnerable members when it thinks no one is watching. This story ends, but many await. Subscribe, so no tale escapes you.